begins, it be not with sound, but with a cognitive dissonance so sharp, so violently abrupt, that it threatens to
The worst sound in the world isn't the flatline. It isn't the crunch of bone during CPR, or the wet, rattling gasp of terminal secretions. The worst sound is the sound of prayer. Specifically, the desperate bargaining prayers of a family begging God for a miracle that I know, with absolute clinical certainty, is never coming. I stood in the doorway of room 402, watching the rise and fall of Mr. It is a color that exists nowhere in nature, a hue of wet ash mixed with old putty, the distinct waxy pallor of a body that has ceased to manufacture new red blood cells and is instead recirculating sludge. They filter this visual data through a desperate lens of hope until it renders not as terminal multisystem organ failure, but as a sleeping father. And the prisoner, unable to speak through the plastic tube jammed down his throat, was begging for the key with every laboring beat of his heart. It was a moment of absolute crystalline moral clarity in a world that had dissolved into shades of exhausted gray. The hospital hummed around me, the massive organism breathing in its sleep. I could feel the distinct subterranean vibration of the ventilation systems and the distant thrum of heavy compressors in the basement circulating sterile air that smelled of isopropyl alcohol and floor wax. But inside the glass walls of room 4, the silence was heavy enough to choke on, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I stared at the IV pole, a towering chrome tree bearing poisonous fruit. A chaotic tangle of clear spaghetti tubing cascaded down from the hanging bags, merging into a plastic manifold before snake-biting into the side of his neck. I focused on the central line, a triple-lumen catheter sutured directly into his right internal jugular vein. The anatomy there was a ruin. The skin around the insertion site was angry and macerated, weeping a clear, serous fluid beneath the peeling edges of the tegaderm dressing. The black silk sutures were pulled taut, cutting into flesh that had the consistency of wet tissue paper, threatening to tear through with the slightest tug. The Alaris pump glowed with a harsh spectral light in the darkened room, the green LEDs casting long, unnatural shadows across the sheets. It illuminated the label of the primary bag, the bold black letters spelling out his sentence: norepinephrine, Levophed, the leave 'em dead drug. I watched the drip chamber, the metronome of his artificial existence. It was a potent vasoconstrictor, a chemical tourniquet. At this dosage, it was clamping down on every peripheral vessel in his body with crushing force. It was violently squeezing the blood out of his hands, his feet, his gut, and his skin, redirecting every precious drop to the core to keep his heart and brain marinated in oxygenated blood. It was the only thing keeping his mean arterial pressure at a compatible with life 65/40. Below that number lay the abyss, the flatline, the end. I didn't just predict the future, I hallucinated it with the clinical precision of a trauma surgeon. I ran the simulation in my head, a high-definition reel of horror I had watched play out 100 times before in this very room. If I did nothing, if I let the protocol run its course, he would linger in this purgatory for 12 more hours. I could already see the physiology collapsing. His lactate levels would climb past 10, then 15, turning his blood into metabolic acid that would eat his organs from the inside out. The ischemia in his fingertips would creep up past the knuckles. I imagined watching them turn from mottled purple to the color of charcoal, the tissue dying, drying, and hardening until his hands looked like shriveled mummy's claws. Then inevitably the chemistry would fail. The proton pumps would stop, the cell walls would burst, and the acidity would stop the heart. The monitor would scream, that piercing rhythmic shriek of a red alarm that cuts through walls and dreams alike. But by then, it would just be noise over a corpse. It wouldn't be the polite, rhythmic chirp of a lead falling off or a probe disconnecting. It would be the flatline tone, the absolute zero of sound, followed instantly by the high-pitched, relentless wail of the monitor screaming a lethal arrhythmia, V-fib, or a systole. If that sound tore through the silence, I would be forced, legally, morally, professionally bound, to slam my palm against the code blue button on the head wall. The repercussions would be instantaneous. The blue light outside the room would erupt, flashing strobe, darkness, like a nightclub from hell, turning the sterilized corridor into a disco of panic. The room, currently a sanctuary of shadows, would flood with strangers. They see a chest rising and falling and call it life. You see a mechanical ventilator forcing pressurized air into stiff, fluid-filled lungs that can no longer exchange oxygen on their own. But the sight is forgiving compared to the smell. How do their olfactory nerves bypass the assault on the senses? The room is thick with it, a physical weight in the air that clings to the fibers of your scrubs and settles in your hair. Residents with coffee-stale breath, respiratory therapists dragging glide scopes, the crash cart team rattling in like they were pushing a shopping cart full of scrap metal, all shouting, all brimming with a chaotic, caffeinated adrenaline that had no business in a place of rest. We would tear his gown open, buttons popping and rolling across the floor, exposing that fragile, bird-cage chest where every rib was visible beneath skin like parchment paper. I, or someone just like me, would interlock our fingers, hyperextend our wrists to lock the elbows, place the hard, unforgiving heel of a palm on the center of his sternum, and drive our entire body weight down. Crack. It is never a clean break. It never sounds like wood snapping. It sounds like stepping on a wicker basket. I would feel his ribs snap like dry, brittle twigs under a heavy boot. I would feel the costochondral separation, the cartilage of the sternum tearing away from the bone, a sickening, grinding pop that vibrates all the way up the radius and ulna, rattling your own teeth in your skull. We would keep pushing, 100 compressions a minute, ignoring the crunch, effectively turning the architecture of his chest into a bag of wet gravel. We would slap the sticky defibrillator pads onto his emaciated skin and shock him with 200 joules of raw electricity, enough to make his frail 80-pound body arch off the mattress, a grotesque marionette jerked toward the ceiling by invisible, violent strings before slamming back down. And when the peripheral veins collapsed, as they inevitably would in a body shutting down, we would bring out the drill. We would find the flat spot of his shin, the tibial tuberosity, and drive a thick needle straight into the marrow, an intraosseous line. The motor would whine like a handyman's power tool in a quiet church, just so we could force-feed his system more epinephrine. We would be whipping a dead horse, chemical torture to force-start a heart that was begging, screaming in its silence to stop. We would brutalize this corpse for the sake of the living, all for the sake of a son sitting in business class, 30,000 feet above the freezing Atlantic, sipping Dom Perignon and checking his Rolex, demanding we keep dad fighting until his Uber Black pulled up to the hospital curb. My hand hovered over the Alaris pump interface. It wasn't trembling. It was steady, terrifyingly, professionally steady. It was the hand of a mechanic deciding which wire to cut. I didn't turn the pump off. I couldn't simply hit stop. The machine was too smart. It was a snitch. It would sense the immediate drop in flow pressure. It would screech occlusion or pump stopped, a digital accusation that would echo down the hallway and light up the central monitoring station. That noise would wake Sarah, the charge nurse, who was dozing over her charts. That would leave a digital fingerprint in the server logs. That would be negligence. That would be murder in the unblinking binary eyes of the law and the electronic medical records audit trail. No, there was a quieter way. A path of least resistance that looked less like intervention and more like physiological inevitability. A line failure, a tragic, unpreventable mishap in the dark. I moved my hand away from the glowing screen and reached for the connection point where the IV tubing screwed into the distal port of the central line. My knuckles grazed his skin. The plastic hub was resting right against the warmth of his neck, pulsing faintly with the last tired beats of his life. I turned my gaze to the corner of the room where the shadows pooled the thickest. Sarah was folded into the hospital recliner, a piece of vinyl furniture designed for waiting, but never for comfort. She squeaked softly against the faux leather as she shifted, her breath hitching in a rhythm that didn't match the mechanical metronome of the ventilator. She was clutching her Bible to her chest like a shield, the gold leaf lettering worn away by the friction of desperate, sweaty-palmed prayers. Her sleep was heavy, a narcotic exhaustion that only comes after days of bargaining with a deaf universe. In her dreams, He was probably still whole, still smiling, still the man who mowed the lawn on Saturdays. In reality, her love had become a weapon. It is the sweet, cloying grape juice stench of Pseudomonas bacteria colonizing the respiratory tract, a fruity, saccharine rot that coats the back of the throat and tastes like cheap wine turned to vinegar. It is an unmistakable biological perfume of infection that signals the immune system has struck its colors and surrendered. She was the anchor, heavy and rusted with hope, dragging his battered hull across the abrasive darkness of the ocean floor. She wouldn't cut the chain. She couldn't see that she was drowning him in the very miracle she was praying for. Mercy is a heavy coat, and tonight I was the only one willing to wear it. Someone had to be the adult in the room. Someone had to step into the role of the quiet executioner so she could remain the grieving saint. If he coded again, when he coded again, it would be violent. The crunch of the sternum, the snapping of osteoporotic ribs like dry kindling, the chaotic violence of ACLS protocols that would amount to nothing but torture. I would carry the weight of this silence, this secret omission, so she never had to carry the sonic memory of his bones breaking under the force of futile compressions. My hand moved through the sterile air, trembling with a microscopic frequency that only I could feel. I located the connection point on the central line manifold. My fingers, gloved in blue nitrile, grazed the hard plastic of the lure lock collar. It was tight, clinically secure, a gateway between life and the void. I applied a gentle counterclockwise torque. The friction was distinct, plastic grinding against plastic, a gritty, tactile resistance that traveled up my arm. I twisted, just a fraction of a millimeter. The threads disengaged, sending a faint vibration through my fingertips, a seismic shift in a world of millimeters. Then I pulled. The tubing separated with a soft, wet pop, a sound so insignificant it shouldn't have been audible over the hum of the infusion pumps. But to me it sounded like a gunshot. The physical connection was severed. The levofed, that potent synthesized adrenaline meant to whip a tired heart into submission, began to pool at the tip of the catheter. Gravity took over where medicine left off. The liquid was clear, innocent, indistinguishable from a tear or saline, yet chemically, it was a tempest. It dripped rhythmically onto the pillowcase. Drip, drip. Each drop was a stolen heartbeat. It soaked into the starched blue cotton, blooming outward in a darkening Rorschach test near his ear. This was the chemical levee that had been holding back the floodwaters of profound septic shock. Now, instead of clamping his peripheral vasculature shut, instead of shunting blood to his starving brain, it was wasting away into the linens. The timeline had been severed, not by the grand design of fate, but by the weakness of a plastic thread and the resolve of my own hand. I stood there, paralyzed, a statue carved from guilt and necessity in the blue-tinged darkness of the ICU. Time didn't just pass, it warped, it dilated, thick and viscous, bending under the gravity of the room. The silence was pressurized, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, punctuated only by the indifference of the ventilator. Hiss, click, sigh. The bellows rose and fell within the glass column, a mockery of breathing. Every second stretched into an hour, heavy with the anticipation of the physiological crash. It takes roughly 30 seconds for residual norepinephrine to metabolize, for the biological half-life to burn itself out in the bloodstream. I locked my eyes on the GE solar monitor mounted above the bed, watching the arterial waveform. That bright red line was the topography of his existence, a mountain range of pressure and resistance. It began to change. The peaks lowered. The dicrotic notch, that sharp, confident little bounce on the downstroke, indicating the aortic valve snapping shut and maintaining vascular tone, began to soften. It blurred, losing its definition. The mountain range was eroding into rolling hills, sliding inevitably toward the flat horizon of zero. The numbers on the GE monitor began to drift, unmooring themselves from the illusion of stability. They floated downward, detached and lazy, like a dead, brittle leaf spiraling from a winter tree to meet the frozen earth. Chapter 65. 60. The mean arterial pressure, the MAP, was sliding. It was a slow-motion collapse of the hydraulic physics keeping him alive. For weeks, I had maintained the artificial tension of his existence through a complex alchemy of titrations, forcing the levofed to squeeze the lumen of his arteries until they were tight, pressurized hoses. But I had turned the stopcock. The invisible scaffolding holding up his entire circulatory system had been kicked away. Without the synthetic catecholamines bullying the smooth muscle of his vessel walls, the arterioles were relaxing. This sickening sweetness mixes with the sharp metallic tang of dried blood crusted around the central line sutures at the jugular, a rusty copper scent of iron oxidizing on skin. And beneath that, the heavy, earthy mushroom cellar smell of gangrenous toes curling from a total lack of perfusion. It is the scent of deep earth and decay. They were dilating, surrendering their tone, becoming flaccid, boggy pipes that could no longer maintain the pressure required to push blood against gravity. But 55. The room remained steeped in the heavy blue-tinged shadow of the night shift. The bedside alarms were set to silent mode, a standard merciful protocol in the ICU at 3:00 a.m., designed to grant the exhausted, grieving families curled up in waiting room chairs a few hours of oblivion. The alerts were channeled strictly to the central station nurse, and the black plastic pager clipped to my waistband. Suddenly, the pager buzzed against my hip bone. It was a frantic, vibrating insect, a mechanical spasm warning me of the structural failure I had engineered. It buzzed again, a phantom itch, screaming for intervention, demanding I rush to the pump and violently increase the dose. "Turn it up," the plastic box commanded. "Fix it." I ignored it. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped behind my back, letting the device vibrate until my skin went numb to the sensation, dissociating from the urgency, until it was just another background hum in a room full of dying machinery. On the monitor screen, the font changed. The numbers turned from a reassuring, rhythmic green to a cautionary yellow. Then, with a digital flicker that seemed almost judgmental, they bled into a critical red. The heart rate climbed momentarily. It was the body's last stand, a final, desperate, sympathetic surge. Inside him, the biology was panicking. The baroreceptors in his carotid arteries tasted the sudden drop in pressure, the emptying of the pipes, and screamed for oxygen, firing a panic signal to the brainstem. The SA node responded with a primitive, electrical violence, whipping the heart to beat faster, harder, faster, but there was nothing to pump against. The fluid volume was pooling in his periphery, settling in his hands and feet like silt. The myocardium, starved of coronary blood flow and running on fumes, was flogging a dead horse. The surge peaked on the screen, a jagged mountain range of white lines, then faltered, widened, and began to slow. 50. 40. I tore my eyes away from the mesmerizing descent of the digital abyss and looked at Mr. Henderson's face. The change was subtle, terrifyingly minute, but to my trained eye, it was miraculous. The rictus of suffering was breaking. The tension in his jaw, a rigid lock that had clenched against the hard plastic of the endotracheal tube for days, finally slackened. The masseter muscles unspooled. The deep furrow between his brows, a canyon carved by pain signals that even heavy sedation couldn't fully mask, smoothed out like a sheet being pulled taut by invisible hands. The micro-expressions of agony, the twitching eyelids, the flared nostrils, vanished. The muscles, no longer seizing under the cortisol-flooded stress of forced survival, let go. The gray pallor of the ICU vanished beneath a sudden, soft neutrality. He looked for the first time in 3 weeks like a human being rather than a biological experiment suspended in amber. The machine gave a low, soft beep, signaling critical low pressure, a sound usually terrifying, a sound that typically sent crash carts flying down the hallway. Now, in the stillness, it served as a bell tolling the end, singular and final. Any human sound was immediately drowned out by the rhythmic, pneumatic whoosh hiss of the ventilator. It was a mechanical beast, indifferent to the soul it was tethered to, continuing to shove tidal volumes of 500 milliliters of oxygenated air into a chest that no longer possessed the perfusion to transport it. I watched the plastic corrugated tubing jump with every forced breath, inflating the lungs like stiff, rotting balloons. The gas exchange was a fiction now. The alveoli were open, but the capillaries surrounding them were stagnant swamps. I waited. I needed absolute certainty. I stood like a statue at the foot of the bed, my eyes locked on the GE monitor as the red digits of the arterial line trace flickered downward. 231. Then the number settled. 30. 30 is the physiological point of no return. It is the cliff edge of biology. At a mean arterial pressure of 30, the pressure gradient is functionally insufficient to overcome the resistance of the cranial vault. Calculation is automatic for me now. Cerebral perfusion pressure equals MAP minus intracranial pressure. They edit out the black necrosis creeping up the metatarsals, a stark, jagged demarcation line moving millimeter by millimeter like frostbite on a doomed mountaineer. They ignore the fact that the tissue is mummifying while attached to a living host, turning hard and leathery, the blackness consuming the pink. They hold the hand, but they ignore the feet, blind to the biological truth that the body is already decomposing, long before the heart has the good grace to stop beating. With a MAP of 30, there is zero perfusion to the brain. The lights were out. The complex architecture of the self, memory, fear, love, had been starved into silence. The synapses had stopped firing, the sodium-potassium pumps had failed, and the neurons were swelling into oblivion. The pain was gone because the biological machinery required to process the electrical signal of agony had simply shut down. The suffering had ended, not by miracle, but by math. I moved quickly now, adrenaline surging through my veins and displacing the solemnity of the moment. Precision was key. This was the cleanup of a crime scene disguised as high-level medical care. My gloved hands flew to the dangling IV tubing. I snatched the plastic line and reconnected it to the proximal port on his triple-lumen central line, twisting the plastic lure lock until I felt the vibration of the threads catching, followed by the satisfying, definitive click of engagement. The circuit was closed. I dragged the cuff of my scrub jacket over the pillowcase, the fabric thirsty and quick to absorb the damp, betraying spot of wasted medication. I rubbed until the cotton was dry, erasing the physical evidence of my mercy. I glanced at the Alaris infusion pump. The screen still glowed with its deceitful green backlight, claiming to push the vasopressor at 20 micrograms per minute. It was a digital lie. The pump was running, the gears were turning, but the body was too far gone to respond to the chemistry. The metabolic cascade had begun in earnest. The lactic acidosis was total. His pH was crashing, turning his blood to vinegar, denaturing proteins and unraveling the very fabric of his cells. The heart had spiraled down a dark, hypoxic well from which it could not climb, the myocardium stiffening as the ATP stores ran dry. He was free. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and cold as a river stone. I took a deep, shuddering breath, physically rearranging my features in the reflection of the dark window. I banished the cold calculation from my eyes, softening the corners, and pulled down a mask of professional, heartbroken concern. It is a look I have practiced in mirrors for years. I walked over to the vinyl sleeper chair where Sarah lay curled under a thin roughness of a hospital blanket, her face gray with the specific exhaustion that only hospitals can manufacture. I reached out, my hand steady, no tremors, no guilt, and gently shook her shoulder. "Sarah?" I leaned in close, invading the sterile bubble of her grief-exhausted sleep, smelling the stale coffee on her breath. I pitched my voice with the precision of a stage actor, coating the words in a layer of thick, faux surprise that tasted like ash and iron on my tongue. I needed the urgency to feel real, but the outcome to feel inevitable. "Sarah. Sarah, wake up. Look at the monitor. His heart rate is dropping." She shot up from the recliner as if electrified, the sudden movement jerking her from deep REM sleep into a nightmare reality. The heavy leather-bound Bible she'd been clutching to her chest like a shield slid from her lap. It tumbled through the air, heavy with scripture, and struck the linoleum floor with a dead percussive thud that echoed louder than a gunshot in the hushed antiseptic room. Her eyes were blown wide, the lids retracted in a spasm of instinctual terror. They were rimmed with a raw, inflamed red, the sclera muddy and swimming in the gelatinous disorientation of a nightmare that had decided to bleed into the waking world. She looked at me, but she wasn't seeing me. She was seeing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the invisible pressure drop that precedes a tornado. What? What's happening? Her voice was a cracked whisper, brittle with sleep and coated in the dry, sticky film of hospital air. I turned my gaze to the Philips IntelliView monitor mounted on the wall, the glowing altar performing the final act of this tragedy. I forced myself to watch the telemetry strip, to bear witness to the physiology I had dismantled. The green line, which had been an erratic, tortured scribble of sinus tachycardia for weeks, was undergoing a catastrophic simplification. Instead, they replaced it all with a soft focus vignette, applying a psychological gauze over the visceral reality. It is a hallmark filter applied to a charnel house, retouching the image until the tubes snake-locked down his throat become invisible to them. The QRS complexes, the electrical shouts meant to squeeze the ventricles, were widening, stumbling over themselves, grotesque and sluggish. The electrical impulses were failing to capture the myocardium, sliding into a slow, drunk idioventricular rhythm. The jagged peak smoothed out into a rolling lazy hill, the intervals stretching longer and longer until the wave collapsed entirely into the beautiful, peaceful horizon of a flat line. I think he waited for you to rest, I said. The lie slipped out, soft and sweet, a verbal narcotic, a sedative for her soul that coated my tongue with the taste of ash. I think he's letting go. She scrambled to the bedside, her wool socks sliding on the freshly waxed linoleum. Scritch, slide, a desperate, clumsy friction. She grabbed his hand, weaving her fingers through his. It was the hand that was now truly cooling, the heat exchanging rapidly with the sterile air conditioning. The capillary refill was gone. There was no pink return, no blood rushing back to the surface, because it was no longer being kept artificially flushed by the high-dose vasopressors. I had silently titrated the levofed to 0. She didn't see the reconnected tubing, now innocent and static, cleared of the evidence. She didn't check the history log on the Alaris pump, which would have told a digital story of rapid, unauthorized withdrawal, a cliff edge created by my thumb. She didn't see the calculated mercy freezing my pupils, turning them into shards of glass, or the killer's steady, thumping pulse hammering against the collar of my scrubs, a drumbeat of adrenaline contained within a statue's stillness. She only saw her father, finally finding the exit door. "It's okay, Dad," she sobbed, the sound raw and wet, like fabric tearing. She buried her face in his chest, pressing her cheek right over the sternum, right over the silent, stilled heart. She was listening for a beat that I had stolen. "You can go. It's okay, we love you. It's okay." The monitor recognized the absolute end a fraction of a second before her grief did. It began to alarm in earnest now, the red light flashing in a strobe of panic, the steady, singular piercing tone indicating a systole. It was the frequency of the void, a sonic lance that cut through the skull. I reached over with a practiced fluid motion, my hand a blur of muscle memory, and silenced it. The electronic scream died instantly, strangled by my touch. The room fell into a heavy, hydrostatic quiet, occupied only by Sarah's weeping and the mechanical hiss-clunk of the ventilator. The machine was blind, dutifully trying to inflate lungs that no longer needed air, forcing oxygen into dead tissue. I reached for the power switch on the side of the gray tower, flipping it to standby. The bellows collapsed with a final plastic sigh, the exhalation valve clicking shut one last time. Silence. True, heavy, absolute silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of death. It was a vacuum that sucked the moisture from your mouth and made the blood rushing in your own ears sound like a roaring river. I stepped back into the corner, blending into the indigo shadows of the room, checking my own breathing, ensuring it was shallow and soundless. I became a fixture of the architecture, a specter in blue scrubs watching the aftermath of my mercy. I stood in the shadows of the alcove, a silent sentinel witnessing the collapse. The daughter didn't just hug him, she poured herself over the husk of her father, her spine curving like a question mark against the stark white sheets. The silence in the room was absolute, amplified by the sudden absence of the ventilator's rhythmic hiss, that mechanical lung that had been breathing for him, forcing oxygen into necrotic tissue for weeks. As I watched her shoulder blades shake with silent sobs, a tectonic plate shifted inside my own chest. The anvil that had been crushing my sternum for the last 12 hours, the crushing responsibility of keeping a corpse warm, suddenly vanished. The release was violent, a sudden depressurization of the soul. My knees actually gave way, the cartilage popping audibly, and I had to grab the cold metal edge of the crash cart to keep from sliding to the linoleum. The tension that had winched my trapezius muscles tight enough to snap a violin string finally went slack, leaving me trembling in the quiet. I had killed him. I had saved him. In their minds, this is a patriarch simply resting, a warrior just needing a little more time to gather his strength, as if strength were a commodity he could still manufacture, as if his mitochondria weren't already shuttering the factories, flipping the switches to darkness one by one. I was 12 hours deep into a 14-hour shift, submerged in the trench warfare of the ICU night rotation. Here, between the hours of 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m., time ceases to flow linearly. Here, in the fluorescent purgatory of the ICU, in that heavy, suspended hour between 3 o'clock a.m. and the first gray bleed of dawn, the demarcation line between murderer and savior dissolves. The framed print of the Hippocratic Oath in the lobby downstairs, with its serif font and gold leaf borders, preaches primum non nocere. First, do no harm. But the definition of harm is fluid when you are standing at the bedside of the damned. Is death the ultimate harm? Or is harm the calculated prolongation of agony? I looked at his hands, swollen with third-spacing edema, the skin tight and shiny like sausage casings, weeping fluid through the pores. I thought of the stage 4 decubitus ulcer eating into his sacrum, a crater of necrotic flesh hidden beneath the linens that we had packed and repacked in vain. I thought of the endotracheal tube that had been eroding the delicate mucosa of his trachea, a plastic invader in a throat that could no longer swallow. Keeping him alive had been a chemically sustained torture, a forcible tethering of a soul to a body that was begging, screaming in every dying cell for the permission to rot. I had pushed the morphine. I had watched the numbers drift down, the heart rate slowing from a frantic flutter to a gentle rhythm, then to nothing. I had stopped the harm. The burnout, however, didn't vanish with his pulse. It was a chronic condition, a malignancy in my own marrow. The grit of invisible sand scratched violently behind my eyelids every time I blinked, a reminder of a 20-hour wakefulness streak. The cafeteria coffee I'd chugged 3 hours ago sat in the pit of my stomach like a pool of battery acid, churning and oxidizing the lining of my gut, rising in sour waves up my esophagus. My mind flashed forward to the morning shift, to the inevitable intrusion of the outside world. I knew the London sun would arrive tomorrow. He would step off a first-class flight, smelling of duty-free cologne and moral superiority, and walk into this room with his suit unwrinkled. He would find a sister hollowed out by grief and a father slowly cooling to room temperature. He wouldn't see the mercy in the silence. He would see failure. He would yell at the attending physicians, threaten litigation, and demand answers from a universe that offered none. Usually, anticipating that conflict would summon the ghosts. Usually, the haunting followed me out the automatic doors and into the parking garage like a strayed dog. It was a specific kind of haunting. The faces of the tortured elderly, eyes taped shut, mouths agape around plastic tubes, screaming silently in the projection room of my RM sleep, asking why I hadn't let them go sooner. But tonight, I inhaled deeply. The air in the room felt scrubbed, antiseptic, and strangely holy. The harsh chemical tang of bleach and betadine seemed to have softened. There was no static in the air, no lingering accusation from the corner of the ceiling. The haunting was quiet. Just for tonight, the ghosts were at peace, and the silence they left behind was the only forgiveness I needed. It behaves like a viscous fluid, heavy and coagulated, slowing down until it pools in the darkened corners of the room like congealing blood. My biology had long since ceased to function as a circadian organism. The concept of day and night had been rendered abstract, stripped of meaning, and replaced by the rigid dictation of dosing schedules, suctioning intervals, and ventilator checks. I was no longer a person with a history or a future. I was a biological machine, a meat servo tasked with converting lukewarm break room coffee into movement. And the coffee, God, that coffee, was acrid, burnt, a thick sludge that had been stewing on the heater coil for 4 hours. It tasted of charcoal, dissolved styrofoam, and desperation. I fueled myself on that black bile, forcing it down a throat raw from recycled air, riding a jagged surge of endogenous cortisol that kept my hands from shaking just enough to thread a needle. My eyes felt packed with silica, a gritty desert dryness scratching against the lids every time I blinked. The sensation had crossed the barrier from tactile to auditory. I could almost hear the friction, a microscopic rasp like sandpaper dragging across dry stone. Henderson's chest, a mechanical rhythm dictated not by his brain, but by the jagged hum of the ventilator shoving oxygen into necrotic lungs. His daughter was on her knees, clutching his swollen, edematous hand, whispering promises to a ceiling tile stained with water damage. She thought she was holding his hand. I knew she was holding a bag of fluid. Mr. Henderson had left the building 3 days ago. Only the machines were keeping the lights on. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't just shine. They were an active aggressor, stripping the protective layers from my psyche. They hummed with a malignant frequency, a relentless 60 hertz buzz that didn't just illuminate the room but vibrated directly against the sutures of my skull. It felt as though that electric drone was trying to pry the bone plates apart, slipping invisible fingers into the fissures to let the headache bloom fully, a red flower of pressure behind my orbits. Burnout. The word is too explosive, too dynamic for what this actually feels like. Burnout implies a fire, a flash, a sudden detonation that leaves a charred husk in its wake. But this isn't a detonation. It is a slow, geological erosion. It is the relentless tide of human suffering washing away the limestone of your empathy, wave after wave, shift after shift, year after year. It is the wind of grief scouring the canyon of your chest until the landscape is utterly unrecognizable. It happens so gradually, you don't notice the topography changing until one day you step out for a smoke or a breath of rain-slicked air, and you realize the ground simply isn't there anymore. The foundation has been scooped out by 1,000 tiny tragedies. You fall, dropping into the abyss of your own indifference, and you don't even scream because you're too tired to inhale, too hollow to produce the sound. Mr. Henderson was 89 years old, a fact that seemed less like a statistic on his wristband and more like an indictment of modern medicine's inability to let go. His chart, a heavy binder thick with potential litigation and futile hope, read like a grim syllabus of geriatric collapse. It was a study in cascading failure, a domino effect where one system toppled the next with terrifying precision. Renal insufficiency triggering fluid overload bogging down the congestive heart failure, the heart failure backing blood up into the lungs until the alveoli drowned in pink froth. Stage 4, renal failure, was a polite clinical euphemism for a biological catastrophe. His kidneys were no longer functional organs, but shriveled, necrotic raisins, calcified and useless. They had long since abdicated their duty, allowing urea and creatinine to saturate his bloodstream until his plasma was effectively toxic soup. The dialysis machine in the corner stood silent, a monolith to a battle we had already lost. There was no blood pressure left to support the circuit. Then there was the sepsis, pneumonia-induced and rampant, which had dissolved the tone of his vasculature. His veins, once elastic and responsive, had dilated into flaccid, leaky tubes. I was pouring high-dose pressors into him, Levophed, vasopressin, neosynephrine, a chemical cocktail designed to clamp down on those vessels with the force of a vice just to maintain a mean arterial pressure that flickered pathetically around 60. His lungs, ravaged by decades of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, were stiff, unyielding leather bags. They possessed zero compliance. I watched the ventilator struggle, the corrugated tubing jerking violently as the machine shoved oxygenated air against the resistance of his scarred alveoli. Whoosh, hiss, whoosh, hiss. It was a mechanical assault, a forced inflation of tissue that only wanted to collapse, and at the epicenter of this physiological ruin lay a failing myocardium. His heart wasn't pumping, it was trembling. An ejection fraction so low it was barely measurable, the muscle flaccid rubber, quivering in his chest cavity like a dying fish flopping on a dry dock, pushing sludge rather than blood. He was a medical textbook entry for end-of-life care, an illustration of systemic failure rendered in tragedy and flesh. In truth, he was a corpse we had simply forgotten to bury. The physiology of death had rewritten his anatomy. His skin had taken on the texture of wet parchment, translucent and weeping serous fluid due to the massive third spacing of fluids. If I rubbed too hard with a washcloth, the dermis would shear off, sliding away to reveal the raw, weeping map of blue-black veins beneath. The modeling, livido reticularis, had begun at his knees 3 hours ago and was now creeping up his thighs like a bruised tide. It begins not with a sound, but with a cognitive dissonance so sharp, so violently abrupt that it threatens to sever the optic nerve right behind the eye socket. It is a psychic shearing, a vibration in the skull that predates the realization of what you are actually seeing. It starts with a toxic strain of morbid curiosity, that insidious, darker instinct that no amount of ethics seminars or compassion training can immunize you against. It was a purple, lacy pattern of stagnating blood, a visual siren signaling that the circulatory system was closing up shop, retreating from the extremities to defend the fortress of the heart and brain. He smelled of breakdown. It is a scent that bypasses the olfactory nerve and hits the brainstem directly, the sweet, cloying, fermented odor of cellular apoptosis mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and the sharp chemical sting of hospital disinfectants, fighting a losing war against organic decay. Yet, glaring from the front of his plastic-sheathed chart, neon bright and legally binding, were 3 words that terrified me more than any airborne pathogen, needle stick injury, or multi-drug-resistant bacteria. Full code. Do everything. The sticker was bright pink, the font a bold Helvetica command, but it felt like a threat penned in blood. It hung there, a sword of Damocles over my shift. It meant that when, not if, his heart finally surrendered to the inevitability of his condition, I was legally obligated to assault this fragile, hollowed-out body. The Hippocratic oath whispered, "Do no harm," but the law screamed, "Keep him alive." My mind replayed the inevitable horror. I would have to mount a step stool, lace my fingers together, and drive my weight down into his chest. I would feel the sickening dry crunch of his osteoporotic ribs snapping like kindling under my palms. I would have to drive a plastic laryngoscope blade into his mouth, cracking teeth to make way for the endotracheal tube, and then we would electrocute his failing myocardium, sending 200 joules of electricity through a chest wall that was little more than paper, until the heart either beat in submission or charred. It wasn't medicine. It was a ritual sacrifice performed on the altar of denial. I entered the room to titrate his drips, moving through the threshold like a diver entering the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. The atmosphere inside was distinct from the hallway, a microclimate of sickness. The air was humid, suffocatingly heavy with the rhythmic exhaust of the humidifier and the radiant heat of a failing metabolism running its final fevered marathon. The room hummed with the chaotic symphony of survival, the rhythmic chug-chug of the IV pumps, the bellows of the vent, the low-frequency dings of monitors sensing the end. Sarah, his daughter, sat in the corner, shrouded in the dim blue light of the cardiac monitor. The vinyl recliner she occupied let out a sharp, rubbery scream, a sound like a wounded animal, with every slight shift of her weight. She looked up at the sound of my footsteps, her neck snapping up with a start. Her face was a ruin of sleeplessness. Deep, bruised crescents hung beneath eyes that were rimmed with raw, inflamed red, the sclera muddy with days of exhaustion and dry hospital air. She clutched a crumpled tissue in one hand and a rosary in the other, her knuckles white, grinding the beads together. But beneath the crushing fatigue, beneath the grief, There was a burning, terrifying energy in her gaze. It was the manic, wide-eyed stare of absolute denial, the look of a woman who believed that if she just wished hard enough, physiology would bow to her love. It was manic hope, a radioactive energy that seemed to vibrate against the sterile walls. It was the frantic, dilated look of a woman bargaining with God in a casino, where the house had rigged the wheel 3 hours ago, yet she refused to leave the table until the lights went out. "He squeezed my hand," she whispered. The sound cracked in the heavy, pressurized silence of the ICU, brittle as dry bone. She was gripping his hand, a swollen, edematous mitt where the fingers looked like translucent sausages filled with water. The skin pulled so taut it shone under the fluorescent lights. Her grip was white-knuckled, a desperate anchor in a storm, pressing her warmth into his cold, boggy flesh. "I felt it, Tom, I swear. He's fighting. He knows I'm here." I froze. You stand at the precipice of the nurse's station, a high-walled fortress of paperwork and monitors that separates the living from the lingering. The linoleum beneath your feet, patterned with beige flecks meant to hide stains, is scuffed by 1,000 frantic rubber-soled shoes, Danskos and Hokas worn down by 12-hour shifts of walking the borderlands of death. You are holding the laminate-sheathed chart. My hand hovered over the soft glowing buttons of the Alaris pump, my finger suspended over the silence key, caught in the gravity of the lie. The pump hummed its rhythmic mechanical chant, a disinterested heartbeat for a man who no longer had one of his own. Slowly, I shifted my gaze to the GE monitor mounted on the wall. The waveform was a jagged, artificial landscape, a neon green line tracing a chaotic, treacherous path across the black screen. The arterial line tracing was dampened, rolling like a gentle hill instead of snapping like a whip. His blood pressure was 68/40. That number wasn't coming from his heart. That number was a mathematical impossibility being sustained entirely by chemical coercion. I looked at the hanging bags, the clear plastic fluid dripping into the chamber. I was running Livafed, norepinephrine, at 20 micrograms per minute. Maxed out, I had vasopressin running at 0. 4 units, stacking pressors like sandbags against a rising flood. I was flooding his system with potent vasoconstrictors, aggressive drugs designed to clamp his peripheral blood vessels shut like a distinct mechanical vice. We were chemically strangling his fingers, his toes, his gut, shunting every drop of available blood toward the brain and the heart just to keep the lights on. If I lifted the sheet, I knew what I would see. The modeling on his knees, the map of purple and gray lace spreading up his shins, the visual evidence of a body cannibalizing its own extremities to preserve the core. Without those drips, without that plastic tubing acting as an external lifeline, his pressure would flatline to 0. Gravity alone would kill him in seconds. He hadn't squeezed her hand. It was a fasciculation. It was a random, meaningless misfiring of dying nerves as the electrolyte balance in his blood went haywire. It was the sodium crashing, the potassium spiking, calcium channels opening and closing in a chaotic, uncoordinated storm before the final silence. It was a glitch in the biological software, a spark jumping across a wet circuit board. Or perhaps it was the Lazarus sign, a spinal reflex, a primitive, unthinking recoil from the pain of existence, bypassing the brain entirely. His cortex was a dark room. Nobody was home to flip the switch. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't look this woman in the eye, with her mascara smudged into grief-stricken war paint, and tell her that her father was a biological puppet dancing on my chemical strings. I couldn't explain to her that the movement she cherished, the squeeze she would tell her children about for years to come, was just the static of a system shutting down. To tell her the truth, that his brain had likely liquefied days ago and we were just ventilating a corpse, would be an act of cruelty disguised as honesty. I had to nod. I had to swallow the acidic bile rising in my throat, burning the back of my tongue, and play the part of the angel in blue scrubs. "He knows you're here, Sarah," I lied. The words tasted like ash and copper in my mouth, coating my tongue with the metallic flavor of betrayal. I adjusted the blanket, covering the purple tips of his fingers, hiding the necrosis. "He can sense your presence. Hearing is the last sense to go." This is the rot of the profession, the dark secret they don't print in the glossy nursing school brochures featuring smiling faces and stethoscopes. Sometimes we aren't healers. We are merely the curators of a comfortable fiction, ushering the living through the door of the dead with soft voices and hard lies. We are not merely healers here. We are the dedicated purveyors of a specialized, intricate fiction. We are on the payroll to administer hope alongside the morphine drips and the heavy sedatives, careful to titrate both with practiced precision, even when the hope is more toxic, more corrosive than the disease itself. We maintain the elaborate pantomime of human agency in a situation governed entirely by the cold, hard, dismantling laws of entropy. We adjust the blankets, we moisten the lips. We speak in soft, confident tones to families who cling to our words like wreckage in a storm, all to disguise the fact that we are merely spectators to a thermodynamic inevitability. The fear began to assert itself around 2:00 a.m., the true witching hour of the intensive care unit. It crept up the back of my neck, tactile and intrusive, like a cold draft whispering from the mouth of an open grave. It wasn't the fear of ghosts. God, I wished it were ghosts. Ghosts are clean. Ghosts are narrative. It weighs heavy in your hand, dense not merely with the compressed wood pulp of paper, but with the crushing gravity of failing organs, unbalanced electrolytes, and inevitable outcomes. You run your thumb over the plastic edge, feeling the grit of dried sanitizer and dust, anchoring yourself in the tactile sensation before you look up. Ghosts are memories with a shape. This was the fear of the machinery, of the pulsating, artificial biome that we had constructed. It was a terror of the monster made of plastic tubing, distinct chirping alarms, and synthetic adrenaline that refused to let the dead simply die. Ghosts are spiritual, nebulous things that drift through walls and rattle chains in the attic of the mind, seeking resolution. That wasn't what haunted room 412. This was the terror of the physical reality of suffering. It was the abject fear of the meat, the biological machinery grinding its gears, stripping its cogs, and continuing to cycle blindly long after the operator had fled the building. The soul was gone, but the chemistry remained, shackled to the bed by electricity and plumbing. I stood over the bed, my shadow falling across the tangled webs of IV lines. The overhead fluorescent lighting hummed a low-frequency insectoid buzzing sound that seemed to bypass my ears and burrow directly into the roots of my molars. I looked down at Mr. Henderson's arms, resting heavily atop the sterile blue blanket. The skin was weeping. Literally. In the clinical notes beneath the timestamp, I would type anasarca, a sterile, distinct Latin term for extreme generalized edema, but the reality on the mattress was far more grotesque than the textbook definition. We had pumped so many liters of normal saline, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and aggressive vasopressors into his collapsing veins that his vascular system had finally surrendered. We had forced the Livofed to clamp down on his peripheral arteries to maintain a blood pressure compatible with life, but the cost was absolute integrity. His capillaries had become sieves. His kidneys had capitulated a week ago, the delicate nephrons calcified and useless, sending his creatinine skyrocketing into toxic ranges, leaving the fluid with nowhere to go but out. Driven by the relentless physics of hydrostatic pressure, the water backed up into the interstitial tissues. It swelled him, distorting his features, erasing the knuckles of his hands and the definition of his jaw, until his skin was translucent, shiny, and tight as a snare drum tuning up to snap. And now, the physics of his body were failing completely. The structural integrity of the epidermis was breaching. The water was seeping out through the microscopic pores, bypassing the sweat glands entirely. It beaded on his forearms, clear and yellow-tinged, gathering like condensation on a cold soda can left out in the sweltering summer heat. I watched a single droplet coalesce near his elbow, heavy and sluggish, before rolling down to stain the pristine starch of the hospital linens. He was leaking his own life support. He was weeping serous fluid, crying from his arms, his legs, his chest, because his eyes no longer could. We were drowning him. It was a slow-motion execution, masked as salvation, a waterboarding occurring from the inside out. We were doing far more than hydrating him. We were systematically drowning him from the inside out. We were waterboarding his individual cells, pumping liter after liter of saline and aggressive vasopressors into a vessel that had long since sprung leaks. We forced fluid into the interstitial spaces, bloating his tissues until his fingers looked like sausages casing tight, and his eyelids were swollen into translucent, fluid-filled blisters. All of this to keep his mean arterial pressure, his MAP, hovering above 65, satisfying the hungry, glowing algorithms of the bedside monitors. We worshiped the number, sacrificing the flesh. It was a gruesome ritual performed for the sake of a daughter who sat curled in the corner, her spine bent under a crushing weight, unable to bring her dry mouth to form the shape of the word goodbye. And it was for the son, an invisible authority 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic, who sought to assuage his guilt with aggressive measures commanded over a crackling Polycom speakerphone. His voice, stripped of humanity by the digital connection, demanded we do everything, as if biology were a negotiation. I reached out to adjust the linen, my movements possessing a paradoxical quality. Surgical precision married to abject terror. I had to be careful not to tear him. His skin, thinned by age and ravaged by high-dose steroids, had lost its structural integrity. It was no longer a barrier, it was a liability. You look past the glowing telemetry monitors, where green lines trace the erratic, jagged geography of struggling hearts, premature ventricular contractions skipping like stones across the screen. You look past the blinking infusion pumps, the Alaris towers standing like sentinels, mechanically pushing levofed and vasopressin into collapsing veins. You stare into the cavern of room 402. Then you look at the family. If I rubbed too hard or gripped his wrist with even a fraction too much friction, the epidermis would shear right off. It would slide away like wet silk, revealing the raw, weeping dermis underneath. It is a phenomenon known as skin slip, a term usually reserved for the prep room of a mortuary to describe decomposition, yet here we were, battling it in bed 12 of the ICU. "On 3, I whispered to no one, bracing my knees against the bed frame. As I shifted his hip to relieve a pressure ulcer forming on his sacrum, a deep purple bruising of tissue dying from the weight of his own bones, Mr. Henderson groaned. It was a low, guttural sound, wet and thick, vibrating through the phlegm collecting behind the plastic cuff of the endotracheal tube jammed down his throat. The sound rattled the tube, shaking the aggressive taping that plastered the device to his cheeks. That tape had distorted his face, pulling his lips back into a permanent rictus grin, a silent scream fixed in adhesive. The pilot balloon, the small external bladder indicating the tube was anchored in his trachea, rested limp and obscene against the pulse of his neck. It wasn't consciousness. I knew that with the cold certainty of a clinician. The neurologist knew that when they charted his lack of reflexes. It was the brainstem, the reptilian core, firing blindly in the dark in reaction to a noxious stimulus. It was the body revolting against the intrusion of the plastic, the Foley catheter snaking up his urethra and into his bladder, the rectal tube glued to his perineum, and the central line stitched with black silk into his jugular, dumping chemicals directly into his heart. "Shh, shh, Dad, it's okay," Sarah whispered, lurching forward from her vigil. She hovered by the bed rail, terrified to touch him, but unable to pull away. Her eyes were rimmed with red, exhausted dark circles, bruising the delicate skin beneath them. She stroked a patch of his forehead with a trembling hand, navigating the minefield of tape and plastic tubing. "The nurse is just helping you. You're okay. We're here." "I'm not helping him." And the thought erupted in my mind, violent and sharp, screaming against the oppressive silence of the room and the rhythmic, mechanical whoosh hiss of the ventilator. The machine breathed. The man merely accepted the air. "I'm torturing him." The realization tasted like bile, rising bitter and yellow at the back of my throat. I looked down at my hands, encased in blue nitrile. I was the torturer in blue scrubs, the banal executioner acting on the standing orders of a daughter paralyzed by the agonizing weight of grief, and an attending physician terrified of a malpractice lawsuit from the litigious voice on the phone. The doubt gnawed at the lining of my stomach, acidic and hot. Was this medicine? Was this the noble art of healing? Or was this high-tech necromancy animating a corpse with drips and electricity just to say we could? We weren't extending his life. That was a lie we told the families in the bright light of day. In the shadows of the graveyard shift, the truth was far more grotesque. We were merely elaborating on his death. We were taking a process that nature, in her brutal but efficient mercy, intended to take minutes, a quick cessation of electrical impulse, a fading to carbon and silence, and stretching it into a weeks-long agonizing ordeal of cellular breakdown. We were the architects of a slow-motion decay, forcing biology to weep its way toward an inevitable conclusion, frame by excruciating frame. By 3:30 a.m., the helplessness wasn't just an emotion. It was a physical mass, a heavy leaden stone calcifying in my gut, pressing against my diaphragm until it was hard to draw a full breath. I backed out of the room, peeling off my yellow isolation gown with a snap of plastic, but the sound of the ventilator pursued me into the hallway. Whoosh hiss! Whoosh hiss! It was the rhythm of forced air invading a chest wall that no longer wanted to rise, a mechanical bellows pumping a corpse. I collapsed into the ergonomic mesh chair at the nurse's station, the wheels groaning under the weight of my exhaustion. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, not from caffeine, but from a vibrating, low-level despair. The computer screen blurred into a smear of harsh, retinal burning white light and dancing black Helvetica. They are huddled in the far corner, tucked beneath the shadow of the wall-mounted television, a knot of trembling shoulders and tear-stained faces. They clutch styrofoam cups of lukewarm cafeteria water like talismans against the reaper, their fingers denting the soft white material, leaving crescent moon nail marks in the foam. The electronic medical record was a hungry god, demanding data sacrifices, and so I fed it lies. I was documenting urine output that didn't exist, typing 0 into column after column, and recording blood pressures sustained only by a slurry of synthetic adrenaline that we pumped through his central line. I was charting on a ghost. Room 402 is tanking again, Julie, the charge nurse, muttered. Her voice was flat, a monotone frequency stripped of all urgency by 2 decades of exposure to the macabre. She didn't look up from her phone. In the dim light of the station, her face was illuminated in a ghostly cerulean pallor by the glow of social media, making her skin look as hypoxic as the patients we treated. She sat there, slumped, scrolling past frantic cat videos and high-saturation vacation photos while, 10 feet away, a man dissolved in his own bed. "Check his Levofed drip, would you?" she added, the request slipping out between swipes of her thumb. The blue light of the smartphone cast spectral shadows into the hollows beneath Julie's eyes, emphasizing the dark circles of chronic sleep deprivation. Her thumb moved with a rhythmic hypnotic lethargy, sliding upward across the glass, scrolling through high-definition photos of turquoise water and blindingly white sand. A Maldives getaway she couldn't afford on a nurse's salary and would never book because she didn't have the energy to pack a suitcase. She wasn't really seeing the ocean. She was just trying to blind herself to the unit, to the beige walls, to the smell of antiseptic and C. diff that permeated the air like a stale fog. "Titrate the levo up," she murmured, her eyes glazed over as she liked a photo of a stranger's perfectly plated brunch. "Keep his MAP above 65. Nephrology is complaining about his perfusion pressure. They want to save the kidneys." I stared at her, the request hanging in the sterile, recycled air like a noxious gas. The absurdity of it made my teeth ache. Nephrology wanted to perfume dead tissue with blood that had turned to sludge. "He's maxed out, Julie." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow, metallic, scraping against the back of my throat like it was climbing up from the bottom of a rusted well. It was the voice of someone who had seen too much and said too little. I raised a hand, heavy as iron, and pointed a trembling finger toward the darkened room where the machinery hummed its indifferent song. "He is maxed on Levo. He is maxed on Vaso. He is maxed on Neo. The trilogy of chemically induced existence," I said, listing the vasopressors like the ingredients of a witch's brew, a poison designed to animate the dead. "Look at his fingers, Julie, they're purple. We've clamped his peripheral vasculature so tight to keep his heart beating that his extremities are dying. If I turn the knobs any higher, I'm not treating hypotension anymore. I'm just pickling him." We are clamping down his peripheral vasculature so tight that we are physically cutting off blood flow to his gut and his fingers just to shunt a few more drops of oxygenated blood to a brain that turned into mush 3 days ago. We are drowning him in Levophed and vasopressin, chemical tourniquets squeezing every artery until they collapse. Look at his toes, Julie. Really look at them. They aren't just cyanotic, they're turning necrotic. They are charcoal black and hard as stone. We are rotting him from the outside in, sacrificing the extremities to keep a pump running that wants desperately to stop. Julie finally stopped scrolling. The blue light of her smartphone screen died, leaving her face in the harsh, flickering fluorescence of the nurse's station. She placed the phone face down on the laminate counter with a sharp, deliberate clack that echoed louder than the telemetry alarms. When she looked up, her eyes were hard flint, the last embers of nursing compassion having burned out somewhere around 2014, leaving only administrative ash and a rigid adherence to the chain of command. Doctor's orders, Tom. You know the protocol. We don't decide who is futile. We facilitate. She rubbed her temples, her fingernails digging into the papery skin there, a gesture of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with moral fatigue. Just keep him alive until the sun flies in from London tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon. The words landed like lead weights dropped into a deep, stagnant well. Another 12 hours, another 720 minutes of physiological torture. They looked like frightened deer caught in the strobe light violence of a thunderstorm, their eyes wide and darting, waiting for the thunderclap, the flatline tone that they pray to a silent God will never come. And finally, shielding your own psyche with layers of professional indifference, you force your gaze to the bed. You stop looking at the person. You look at the meat. You wonder, with a genuine, detached, almost scientific fascination, how they do not see what you see. I looked up at the analog clock mounted above the crash cart. The red second hand swept past the 12 with a jerk, indifferent to the suffering it measured, carving time into slices of agony. That meant another 12 hours of the servo-eye ventilator ramming 600 milliliters of oxygen into stiff, fluid-filled lungs. I knew his lung compliance was garbage. I could see the peak inspiratory pressures spiking into the 40s. We were forcing air into wet cement, blowing him up like a balloon until the pressure shredded the delicate alveoli. Another 12 hours of barotrauma, another 12 hours of his body trying to decompose, his cells screaming for release, while we whipped his heart like a tired, dying horse that had collapsed in the mud. We were beating it to stand up one last time, injecting it with adrenaline and electricity, forcing a performance for a show that no one should be watching. The London Sun. The phrase tasted like bile at the back of my throat, acrid and corrosive. It was the archetype of the ICU, a character we knew better than our own families. He is the relative who hasn't visited in 5 years, the prodigal child carrying a mountain of guilt wrapped in a bespoke suit and a platinum frequent flyer status. He demands everything be done, not because he loves his father, but because he confuses medical brutality with penance. He thinks that if we break his father's ribs with chest compressions, cracking the cartilage like dry twigs, if we shatter the sternum and electric shock the corpse back into a jagged, unnatural rhythm, it proves he was a good son. He needs his father to be warm meat when he arrives so he can say goodbye to a body that still has a pulse, regardless of the agony required to maintain that temperature. He is buying absolution with his father's pain. I turned away from the station, unable to look at Julie's resigned face any longer. The simmering anger in my veins felt less like heat and more like a cold, spreading toxin, numbing my hands. I walked back toward room 12. Crossing the threshold, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the hallway vanished, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical chugging of the life support machines and the heavy, sweet smell of betadine and dying flesh. The transition across the threshold was instant, a physical blow. The air in the room was significantly cooler than the hallway, maintained at a shivering, bacterial-inhibiting 64 degrees. It was recycled air, scrubbed and filtered, yet it couldn't hide the heavy, distinct perfume of the ICU, the sharp, stinging astringency of isopropyl alcohol, the bleach burn of cavi wipes, and underneath it all, the sweet, cloying, unmistakable copper and rot scent of Melina, bowel decay and digested blood that seemed to have permeated the very drywall. Sarah, the patient's daughter, had finally capitulated. For 3 weeks she had been the sentinel, the one moistening his lips with sponges and fighting with the attending physicians, but the human body has limits. She was collapsed in the sleeper chair, the uncomfortable blue vinyl sticking to her skin. Her jaw hung slack, mouth slightly open, a glistening thread of saliva bridging the gap between her lip and the shoulder of her cardigan. A heavy, leather-bound Bible sat on her sternum, rising and falling with a jagged, rhythmic heaving that matched her deep, desperate sleep. She looked smaller than she had yesterday, diminished by the crushing gravity of the room. The room itself was a mausoleum of shadows, a cavern cut only by the aggressive, blinking bioluminescence of the technology keeping the corpse warm. The Alaris pump stack loomed over the head of the bed, a 4-channel totem pole of modern torture. The screens glowed with a toxic neon green, scrolling data that signaled the end. Channel A, norepinephrine. The pump was maxed out, the red digital numbers blazing, 30 mcg/min, chemical adrenaline meant to squeeze blood from stones. Channel B, vasopressin at 0.04 units. Channel C, the milky white syringe of propofol. The machinery clicked, whirred, and chirped, a continuous, syncopated chorus of expensive, futile noises that cost $3,000 an hour. It is a marvel of psychological self-defense, a breathtaking feat of cognitive editing. You wonder how the human brain, that miraculous engine of survival evolved over millions of years to detect threats and rot, can so efficiently edit out the grotesque reality standing 3 feet in front of it. How does their occipital lobe process the gray, clammy sheen of the skin? I turned my eyes to the GE cardiac monitor mounted on the wall. The tracing was a jagged neon green line tearing across the black screen, a sinus tachycardia hammering away at 110 beats per minute. To a layman, it looked like life. It looked like a fight. But I knew it was a lie. That wasn't a heart beating out of vitality or hope. It was a tired, ischemia-riddled muscle being flogged by synthetic catecholamines, whipped into a frenzy just to maintain a mean arterial pressure of 65. It was a dying horse being beaten to keep running. Dominating the soundscape was the ventilator. Whoosh hiss, click, whoosh hiss. The Maquet Servoi stood by the bedside, its accordion bellows expanding and contracting, a robotic lung doing the work of God. I watched the corrugated plastic tubing shudder with every forced breath, condensation droplets trembling on the inside of the plastic like trapped sweat. It forced air into lungs that were stiffening with acute respiratory distress syndrome, forcing the chest to heave upward, pause in a grotesque pneumatic imitation of peace, and then collapse. It was the only sound in the world. I stepped up to the bedside, my rubber soles silent on the linoleum, and stood over Mr. Henderson. I looked at his face, really looked at it, bypassing the clinical assessment of pupil dilation and skin turgor. I looked at the man. His features were contorted, even through the heavy, marshy fog of propofol and fentanyl. It was a mask of gray, waxy clay, etched with a grimace of eternal discomfort. The fluid overload had made his skin tight and shiny, weeping serous fluid through the pores. The adhesive anchor securing the endotracheal tube was digging into his cheek, the skin beneath it angry and breaking down, threatening a pressure ulcer that would never have time to heal. His lips were ruined. They were dry, cracked fissures that wept a little blood at the commissures, stretched impossibly wide around the hard plastic obstruction jammed down his trachea. A bite block prevented him from gnawing through the tube, leaving his mouth permanently agape, a silent cavern drying out in the conditioned air, tongue swollen and pressed against the roof of his mouth. His eyes were taped shut with clear tegaderm to prevent corneal abrasions, giving him the appearance of a botched mannequin. But standing there in the electric hum of the graveyard shift, I could feel them. I could feel the person trapped inside the failing meat. My own sleep deprivation was beginning to fray the edges of reality. The low-frequency hum of the compressors and the fans seemed to coalesce into a voice. It wasn't a sound wave. It was a psychic pressure. I imagined I could hear him screaming. Not with his vocal cords. Those were paralyzed, splinted open by the size 8.0 tube, but screaming with the ragged remnants of his soul, screaming from behind the plastic curtain of the coma. Let me go. The machinery is heavy. The light is too bright. I'm so tired. Please, for the love of a God who has surely abandoned this room, just let me go. I stood paralyzed at the bedside, my gaze tracing the tangled architecture of his survival. It was a chaotic web of IV lines, a plastic nervous system draped over the chrome skeleton of the stand. Translucent snakes coiled and twisted, gravity feeding the synthesized fluids that forced the number on the monitor to stay just above the fatal threshold. They were keeping the blood pressure high enough to satisfy the legal requirements of the chart, high enough to ward off the paperwork of death for another shift, but nowhere near high enough to actually sustain a life worth living. The obsession took hold then, rooting itself in the center of my chest. It wasn't a frenzy. It lacked the hot, palpitating, chaotic flush of a psychotic break or the desperate scramble of panic. It was something far more dangerous because of its stillness. It was a cold, crystal-clear realization, sharp and fragile as the snap of a glass ampoule in a quiet room. The vibrating anxiety that had plagued me for the last 4 hours, the tremors in my hands, the shallow breathing, the dread of the rounds, suddenly vanished. It was instantly replaced by a singular, icy purpose. I wasn't a healer anymore. I looked down at the man trapped in the bed, his body bloated with third-spaced fluids, his skin waxy and yellow. I was a jailer.